Hello, I'm Keely Phillips from the Center for Excellence in Peer Support, and this is a webinar on trauma-informed peer support. The Center for Excellence in Peer Support is part of Self-Help, a consumer survivor initiative of Canadian Mental Health Association Waterloo Wellington. The Center for Excellence in Peer Support envisions a mental health and addiction system where peer support is available at every juncture of the system. We strengthen the practice of peer support by providing consultation and training to non-peer organizations on how to successfully implement and supervise peer staff roles. We offer ongoing supervision and support to peer staff working in non-peer environments, and we further evidence on the value of peer support and lived experience knowledge by engaging in research and evaluation. For more information on the Center for Excellence in Peer Support and on self-help, you can visit our website www.self-help.ca.
Hi, my name is Washington Silk and I work at the Center for Excellence in Peer Support. I will be delivering this webinar for you. Today we're going to talk about what is trauma, how it affects people, and how peer support can become more trauma-informed. This webinar is designed both for individuals and groups, so feel free to pause at any point to answer and ask discussion questions. Trauma. This is the beginning point. So the DSM defines trauma very basically as actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence that a person experiences, or it could be an experience from one of your friends or close family members, or being exposed repeatedly to extreme adverse details of other people's traumatic events. I think that when we're talking about trauma from a peer support perspective, it needs to be a lot wider. So this is how we're going to define trauma for the webinar. It's an emotional shock that overwhelms our abilities to cope, making us go into fight, flight, or freeze modes. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. It affects our brain chemistry, and experiencing trauma can cause long-lasting mental distress. Okay. One thing that I think is really important to know is that not all traumatic events can lead to a trauma response in a person. So if something difficult happens, like you come across a bear when you're camping and they attack you, your system will go into fight, flight, or freeze, you run away, and maybe you're fine. So if you're able to stabilize yourself, you're able to calm down, you're able to self-regulate, you're able to create meaning from that event, you're able to get support from people around you, you can potentially recover faster. That means that traumatic event might not cause some long-term trauma implications for your health. But if you're not able to stabilize or to self-regulate or to create meaning of the event, then it could have some significant impacts in how you function. Below, it really nicely summarizes the categories in which human beings experience distress in different parts of their life as a result of trauma: physical health, mental health, behaviors, relationships, community, and spirituality. So let's talk a little bit about the biology of the brain. I got this slide from psychologytools.com. I encourage you to go there. They have a lot of great tools that help break this down. So, in our brains we know that we have an amygdala. Many people view this as our threat system. It's a part of our brain that says, oh, you know, there's a bear over there, let's go and let's pay attention, what's going on? It will flood our brain with cortisol and adrenaline and will trigger our fight or flight response. When it does that, it causes some certain physiological reactions. For example, it actually shuts down our digestive system. If you think about it, digesting what you had for lunch isn't all that helpful when you could use that energy to continue running for the bear, for example. But another effect, or something that it shuts down in our brain, is it really disrupts our hippocampus. So our hippocampus, as it says in the slide, is like our librarian. It helps us tag memories, store them, move them from short-term to long-term memory. It really helps us integrate our day-to-day experiences. But when something traumatic or difficult is happening and our amygdala is going off, flooding our brain with, again, adrenaline and cortisol, our hippocampus shuts down. And this has some very long-term effects on how we process trauma, because that means that the trauma memory, if the hippocampus shut down and can't process it, is kind of stored in a place where it shouldn't be or is fragmented. So it remains unprocessed. It could be disintegrated or not integrated, fragmented, and it could feel current for the person instead of knowing that it happens in the past. So a person can experience then later on a trigger that causes the hippocampus to recall that event, but it can't quite recall it in the same way. It might be fragmented, and the person might not be able to tell what that event is currently happening or is an issue from the past, and then your amygdala goes off and floods you with some very potentially distressing and discomforting situations. So what this looks like for most people that have a trauma response or reaction, that anything can remind them of a trauma. We call that triggers often. It could be a place, it could be a smell, it could be a person, and it triggers those feelings again of the flight, fight, or freeze. We often call these anxiety, terror, anger. You might not feel like you're really there right now. You could re-experience a trauma all over again. Obviously, that can be a very difficult thing for people, so they might want to escape it, and they might look for short-term relief. So what this could look like or feel like for a person is beautifully displayed in this cartoon. You can follow the link after posted on this video. This cartoon is from everydayfeminism.com. So I'm just going to summarize this, that Jenny has PTSD, and her and her friend go for an ice cream, and the ice cream reminds her of a situation in which her father passed away. Jenny is able to explain to her friend that this is happening and that she needs to remove herself from the situation as it's a trigger and difficult to handle. And her friend is really great because her friend says, "Oh, I understand," not blaming Jenny for behaving weird just for getting ice cream. Please read the cartoon if you have a chance. It has some beautiful descriptions for other people. So who can experience trauma? How can they experience trauma? Trauma can happen at the individual level, the family level, and community level. Take a second and think or discuss with the person next to you about what kind of trauma people can experience in these different ways. Some of the ways that I've thought of are individuals can experience interpersonal violence, sexual assault, neglect and abandonment, disasters, death of someone close by to them, and misuse of power of a trusted individual. Family members perhaps can experience death, also interpersonal violence, community and school bullying. So after learning all of this, please take a moment to think to yourself or discuss with your peers if you think that peer support needs to create their own definition of what trauma is, and should it be different than the DSM. When we talk about how communities can experience trauma, one of the ways that I think is really pertinent to peer support is how members of the mental health or people who experience substance use issues can experience some things that could be traumatic as a community. So historically, this might look like forced and coerced treatment, forced and coerced sterilization, institutionalization, no hope for recovery. Currently, might be lack of hope, stigma, finding it difficult to access help, poverty and unemployment, inadequate housing, incarceration, lack of wait times, how medication impacts you, lack of diversity for treatment options, marginalization for large parts of the community. Let's talk about trauma and gender. So, from research that we know of, 10% of women and 5% of men are diagnosed with PTSD. Up to 1/3 of people exposed to trauma develop PTSD, so remember, not everybody does. And trends show that men have a higher rate of trauma, but women have a higher rate of childhood trauma, and therefore are more likely than men to develop PTSD. There's not a lot of research done on folks that identify as gender non-binary or transgendered, but we do know that in Ontario, 38% of transgender folks experience suicidal thoughts and 10% attempt. Let's talk about how PTSD and addiction fit together. So we know that 12 to 34% of folks who struggle with substance use issues also have PTSD. For women, the rates are a little bit higher. This might be because women typically experience more childhood and physical violence in their childhood, which puts them at an increased risk of experiencing and suffering from PTSD. For men, it's more like violent situations such as combat or crime. There's been no research that has been done on transgendered folks. There's no drug of choice either for people that have PTSD who use substances to cope, but lots of people report that they self-medicate in about 2/3 of the cases. So substance use and PTSD are very much linked. So let's talk about why getting help is hard if you've experienced trauma. So often organizations are not trauma-informed. One of the ways locally we're working to change this is the Waterloo Regional Trauma Informed Group is creating webinars and information sessions, both on how organizations and support workers themselves can become trauma-informed. There'll be a link at the end of the webinar that you can follow, and you can look at their PowerPoint presentations as well. For substance use, PTSD does not go away with abstinence, and often mental health and addiction systems are siloed and they don't really talk to each other. So when you're getting help with substance use, it doesn't help with the PTSD. It cannot only be treated within the medical model. Things like drugs or antidepressants are not the only solution. It's often about connection and support and treatment to help somebody overcome a traumatic event in their life. So, let's talk about power and privilege in organizations. This plays a significant role in whether people feel comfortable accessing services. So, like, look at the cartoon, see if you can get a chuckle out of it or get why it's even here. It says, maybe you should ask yourself why you're inviting all these duck hunters into your life right now. I think that's a very victim-blaming sentence. So things like poverty, racism, ableism, saneism, homophobia, stigma, victim blaming, societal violence like residential schools, power and privilege, and how our organizations work to support people greatly impact whether we're accessible and trauma informed. I would like to read to you a statement that's anonymous that talks about the narratives that we tell each other as a group or as an agency that is not trauma-informed and does not acknowledge the power and privilege of the roles that we play in supporting people. So, social services have a habit of inciting, facilitating bad behaviors by people who come to us for help. We do it with our bureaucracy, surveillance, and paternalistic approaches, but we really struggle to take real responsibility. Instead of noticing the ways we co-create these incidences, the stories we tell sound like, that client stole from us, and my program suffers, or that client is banned from our services. And a few stories are nuanced with, she was greeted by an under-supported CURT volunteer who asked her a shaming question. It was the 3rd time she left our place with her head low. Or, my organization does suck sometimes. Or, we are overworked and we miss a lot of important things. Or, I feel so insecure at work that I have to prioritize my relationship with my coworkers over advocating for service users. We forget the key pieces in the way we retell our stories, placing blame on individuals, reinforcing our alliances, and keeping institutional power in check. So, is that client-centered? Does that acknowledge the power and privilege? Is that trauma-informed when we talk about the people that we are working with? Something for you to think about. So when people do reach out for mental health support, if they're in distress and they're struggling, many people often get re-traumatized. They experience a significant loss of power or rights, potentially seclusion and restraints. People might feel like they need to share their story over and over again, which could re-traumatize them in order to get the help that they need. So these kinds of things might be why people avoid accessing mental health services, or why they find it really difficult or have a complicated relationship. So what does peer support mean when we want to become trauma-informed? To me, it means shifting from asking what is wrong with you to what happened to you. When we look at the core principles of trauma-informed care, which is safety, both physical and emotional. So I would like to give an example of that. Like if you're sitting in a room with a person that you are supporting or walking alongside with, It might be best for you to give them direct access to the door instead of making them sit around the other side of the table where they might feel trapped. That can make a big difference in terms of physical safety. There's also the core informed principles are also trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. So at Self-Help, where I work, we have very explicit recovery values and principles. They're empowerment, hope, self-determination, the elimination of prejudice and discrimination. So, do you see any similarities when you look back and forth between the two? I would like to read to you the self-help principles and values so you kind of get an idea of what we mean by this. So, the value of empowerment. The system will provide opportunities for individuals to exercise control and power with respect to their lives. The value to elicit hope. Recovery cannot occur without hope. The system will encourage hope, and in doing so will focus on skills and abilities. The value of self-determination. The system will recognize and accept that individuals will make their own decisions about their life, and they will be in control of these decisions. Working towards the elimination of prejudice and discrimination. The system will work towards the elimination of prejudice and discrimination towards people with mental health and addiction issues. The value of meaningful choice. The system will recognize and accept that individuals have an unlimited number of choices for which to make their own decisions about their life. All individuals are entitled to the dignity of risk that is inherent in making a choice. So when you compare these two, turn to someone beside you or yourself and ask, where do they line up? Is there more work to be done? And where? The slide outlines the essential qualities folks need when supporting other people who've experienced trauma. This comes from a trauma-informed toolkit. The link will be available at the end of the presentation. If you look at the list of things on this list, for me, the most important ones are doing your own homework, self-awareness, the ability to talk openly and honestly, empathy and compassion. Perhaps look through the list and see which ones highlight your values and what's most important to you. I think these values very closely align with peer work in general. So let's take a look at how the essential qualities of working with people who've experienced trauma relate to how we're going to look at trauma-informed peer practice. So this was adapted from Sherry Mead. So trauma-informed peer support builds upon shared experience and mutual exchange. It acknowledges and eliminates the power differential that are inherent in traditional mental health systems and clinical relationships. And it provides a relationship where you understand people's reactions and behaviors, not as a clinical pathology, but as an understandable reaction to trauma. It's about operating from an empowerment-based model, understanding the role that trauma plays in people's lives. It's meant to facilitate healing, respect voice and choice, work with the survivors in a collaborative way with mutual goals. It's meant to minimize re-traumatization, meet the survivors where they're at, and see adaptive behaviors of strength that serve a purpose. So I personally think that disconnection that comes from experiencing trauma makes it very difficult for people to heal within themselves and within community settings. So disconnection makes people feel powerless, makes it very difficult to trust or form close relationships with people. If you think about it, if your amygdala is going off all the time saying that everything is dangerous, so you're not sure when you can feel safe or not, it would be very hard to form close relationships. It can impact people's abilities to have a relationship with themselves or the community, to reach out for help, and it creates distance with people. So when we do trauma-informed peer support work, we really want to be mindful to not create more disconnection with people. So this is adapted again from Sherry Mead of 13 things that peers do that causes disconnection. So ordering, directing, cautioning, wanting to make a difference. This one I have a really hard time with because obviously as a peer support worker I want to help that person. I want to support them. I want to make a difference. I want them to heal. I want them to recover. But those are my wants, right? They may not be what that person wants or what they need in that moment. It can create disconnection. Arguing or lecturing, saying this is what worked for me, this is what could work for you. That creates disconnection because that person isn't being heard. Another one that's hard for me on this list is agreeing, approving, and praising. I struggle with that when I think about it because I want approval. I want people to say, you're doing good, you're okay. But it might mean that I'm just doing things to get their approval when really I just need to do things for me. So it can create a dynamic that might be unhealthy. So there are many things on this list to think about. So look through it, see what you think, and what causes you pause. So connection versus disconnection. How do we facilitate connection as peers? I'm going to read to you one of my favorite quotes. When you speak to me about your deepest question, you do not want to be fixed or saved. You want to be seen and heard, to have your truth acknowledged and honored. If your problem is so deep, your soul alone knows what you need to do about it, and my presumptuous advice will only drive your soul back into the woods. Please take a second to reflect on this. So, peer support and trauma-informed peer support is about normalizing what has been named as abnormal because of other people's discomfort. So when you see people who are acting or thinking in ways that make other people uncomfortable, but they're doing it for a reason, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal experience. But it's something that, because of stigma and judgment, people dismiss as making it uncomfortable, that it's unneeded behavior, that it's something that needs to be pathologized, right? So it's removing all of those barriers, all of those thoughts. So my discussion question to you, if you're alone or with a group, is how do you connect? How do you create connection? There's a cute little cartoon on the side that can demonstrate that, different ways of creating connection for people. The value of lived experience in peer support is just as relevant and important, if not more important, in trauma-informed peer support. If you take a second to read this quote, you talk to another survivor, and what takes you 2 years to explain to your therapist, you can say in 2 minutes to another survivor. So a discussion question is, how do you think your lived experience helps someone share their own trauma experience? There'll be another webinar later talking about appropriate ways to share your own trauma experience with others that minimizes re-triggering them, which is really important and mindful to do. Let's talk about language. So when you're supporting somebody, or when you're thinking about them, or when you're at work, how you think about someone, the language you use to define them is important and powerful. For example, what's the difference between saying my illness versus my experiences? Or the difference between saying what is wrong with me versus what's happened to me? Or saying that your client, your consumer that you support versus the people I work with? I'm here to help you versus I'm here to learn with you. Language becomes incredibly powerful in how we think about our relationships with people, how we think we're going to help support people, how we're able to meet them where they're at. So peer support is unique, and I think it's uniquely fitted to work with trauma. There's, for example, a buddy-to-buddy system for soldiers where, due to stigma, and you can see this in many different situations, people aren't necessarily wanting to reach out to traditional mental health systems, but when you know somebody else has gone through it and there's mutuality to it, there's a willingness to reach out, to break the silence, to do something that might be hard, but you need to heal. So peer support can offer an alternative to the medical model in this. It's not there to create assessments or do evaluations. It's there to live by peer support values, which closely align with trauma-informed values, and it's person-centered. It's what that person wants and needs at that time without another agenda. So we've been spending a lot of time talking about the negative aspects of trauma and how it affects people's lives. But when people go through trauma, you can heal and you can grow. And we call this post-traumatic growth. It relates to positive exchanges that come from that trauma once you give it meaning, once you heal from it. It can enhance your personal strengths. It can help you appreciate life differently. It can improve your relationships. It can give you new skills and new opportunities. As a peer, it can help you relate to people in a different way. It can help you better understand the situation someone's in, and you can think how you felt when you're in that situation and what would have helped you. talk about how we grow as peers and how we can use our post-traumatic growth in our work. So we know that peers who work to foster recovery experience a lot of gains, specifically self-discovery, mental and physical improvements, building support systems, and professional development. We know that participating in peer support can be really helpful in terms of post-traumatic growth and humanistic growth, but we also must be mindful that we can experience vicarious trauma too. So the definition I have up here is that when a peer helper is emotionally engaged in working with folks who are experiencing trauma, it can shift or disrupt your own sense of hope and meaning in your life. There'll be a number of tools attached at the end for you to perhaps do a quick check-in with yourself. And I think one thing we need to know, specifically for peer support and vicarious trauma, is that evidence shows that professionals who are engaged, committed, and emotionally present are most at risk for vicarious trauma. And for peers in particular, if you work in a workplace that doesn't foster or emphasize personal-centered care, self-determination, and hope, you're less likely to receive the benefits of post-traumatic growth and humanistic growth of mutual aid. It means that you're also more at risk for vicarious trauma. Here's a list of 16 warning signs of a trauma exposure response. So as a peer, if you're starting to feel helpless and hopeless, you have a sense that you can never do enough, if you feel like everything needs to happen now, if you feel like you can't be as creative as you were before, if you have an inability to deliberately listen, or you are avoiding certain situations, you feel like yourself dissociating, you have a sense of persecution or guilt or fear or grandiosity or anger or cynicism. All of these things can be a normal part of life, but they also can be some big signs that you are reacting to difficult circumstances. You're having perhaps a trauma exposure response. So at the Center for Excellence in Peer Support, we did an activity with peers that we support, and these are the things that they outline that help work against a trauma exposure response, that help push back against vicarious trauma. Number one is empowerment to do your job. The next one is when I see the need. So knowing that there's a spot for you, that you can do your job, that there's a need for you, that you can share your lived experience, that there's systemic supports for you, that you have the opportunity to take a step back and reflect on what's going on, and your organization has a belief in recovery. That peer support perspectives are unique, that we need different spaces to work. Some people like working outside, some people like working inside. People need support from their other colleagues, time with people they're supporting, emotional balance, open to experiences. This is an activity you could do yourself about how to build resiliency within your own peer support. So here's some helpful resources for you to review. So there's an app called Hello Cruel World, 110 Alternatives to Suicide. There's a PTSD phone app coach. There's, you'll find it attached in the link below, Safer Coping Skills Sheets, Creating Meaning in PTSD and Substance Abuse Worksheets. There's a book which I highly recommend, Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. There's a Trauma-Informed Toolkit, which some of the diagrams from earlier were taken from. The Waterloo Regional Trauma-Informed Working Group has created 2 presentations, one for organizations on how to become trauma-informed, and another for individuals on how to improve their own trauma-informed skills. You can find those at the website highlighted here. Here are our references. Thank you for your time and commitment to watching this. We really appreciate it. There will be some other resources posted shortly. If you have any questions, you can contact the Center for Excellence in Peer Support.